My name is Maeve Keller, and I was standing at the kitchen sink with a dish towel in my hands when I heard my father give away my house. It was Christmas Eve. The whole house smelled like cinnamon, and the ham my mother only made once a year. And through the thin wall between the kitchen and the dining room, I heard my father tap his glass and tell 11 of our relatives that he and my mother had decided to give my sister's family a real home for the new year, a house with a yard, a place for the grandkids to settle into before the next school semester. He said it the way a king hands down land. The house he was giving away was mine. My name, and only my name, was on the deed. I had bought it as a wreck and rebuilt it with my own 2 hands over 4 years. Nobody at that table had ever once asked me if they could have it. They had simply decided, the way you decide to move a chair. So I stood there with the dish towel in my hands, and I did the thing none of them expected. I dried my hands and I walked back into that dining room, and I smiled, and I lifted a glass, and I clapped along with everyone else. And then, very quietly, over the next 6 days, I made sure that the house my father had just promised my sister would no longer exist for anyone in that family to take. Welcome back to the channel, where the person everyone treats as a shared resource finally remembers the account has an owner. If you have ever been the reliable one, the one everybody leans on and nobody ever checks on, stay with me, because this is the story of the most expensive assumption my family ever made. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. To understand how I ended up clapping for the theft of my own home, you have to understand how I became the family's bank in the first place. And that started a long time before that Christmas. I work as a closing officer at a title company. I am the person who sits at the table when a house changes hands and makes sure the transfer is clean, that the name on the deed is the name that should be there, that every signature and stamp is exactly right, so that years later nobody can come along and say the property was really theirs. I protect the most important transaction most people ever make. I make sure, for strangers, all day, every day, that a home goes to the person who actually owns it and to nobody else. I want you to hold on to that because there is a bitter kind of joke buried in it. I spent my whole career protecting other people's homes from exactly the thing my own family tried to do to mine. But the title company was just my job. My real role, the one nobody hired me for and nobody ever thanked me for, was being the responsible one. I am the older sister. From the time I was old enough to count, I was the steady one, the careful one, the one who saved instead of spent, and somewhere along the way that turned into being the one who paid. It happened the way it always happens, one reasonable favor at a time. My father had medical bills he never quite paid off and never quite mentioned, and I started quietly covering them, a few hundred here, a few hundred there every month for years. When the water heater at my parents' house died, they called me and I paid for the new one. When the property taxes got scary, they called me and I sat at their kitchen table and sorted it out and wrote the check. My younger sister, Tara, overdrew her account so regularly that somewhere along the line, it simply became my job to cover it. And I did, again and again, because saying no felt like dropping something that would shatter. I was the reliable one, the fixer, the daughter who handled things. And I told myself for years that this was love, that being needed was the same as being valued. It took losing my home to teach me the difference. Being needed is not the same as being loved. The people who need you will protect what they need, which is your usefulness, long before they will ever protect you. My family had a way of saying it that I laughed at for years without ever hearing how it sounded. Whenever a bill came up, whenever something needed paying or fixing, somebody would wave a hand and say, "Maeve will take care of it. She always does." And everyone would relax because it was true. Maeve would take care of it. I had made sure of that. I had trained my own family, over a decade, to treat my life as a shared account, and the terrible thing I would come to understand is that they were not even being cruel. They had simply learned the lesson I taught them. The money flowed to whoever needed it most, and I was the account it flowed from. And nobody, least of all me, had ever drawn a line. And then came the house, and they tried to spend the one thing I had built entirely without them, and the line I had never drawn drew itself. Before I tell you what I heard through that wall, you need to understand what that house was to me. I bought it at 30, and it took me 10 years to get there. I worked 2 jobs through community college, processed paperwork at the title company by day, which is how I fell into the work, and waited tables on weekends. I ate a lot of cheap noodles. I drove a car with a back door that didn't open from the inside. I saved every raise instead of spending it. Every bonus went into one account I refused to touch, the house account, the one I guarded like it was the only thing keeping me alive, because in a way it was. My grandmother, Vera, was the one who made me believe I could do it. When I was 22, and no landlord would rent to a girl with no credit and no cosigner, my grandmother sat across from me in a diner, stirred her coffee, and co-signed my very first apartment lease right there on the Formica. And she gave me the only piece of advice she ever pushed on me, and she pushed it hard. She said, Maeve, put your name on something solid and you make sure it's the only name on it. Then nobody gets a vote on your life but you. I held onto that like scripture. I carried it through 10 years of noodles and saved bonuses. When I finally had enough, I did not buy something easy. I bought a wreck. A 1920s craftsman bungalow on the east side, $95,000 because the roof leaked and the foundation needed work and the previous owners had let it rot for a decade. Everyone told me I was crazy. My father said I was throwing money away on a money pit, but I saw what it could be, and over the next 4 years, I rebuilt it. I learned to hang drywall from videos. I refinished the original oak floors on my hands and knees over 3 weekends. I painted every wall myself, fixed the plumbing myself, planted a garden in the little backyard myself. I put $40,000 and 4 years of my own sweat into that house, and I turned a rotting shell into the most beautiful home on the street, worth more than twice what I paid, and I signed every document that made it mine alone. No husband, no cosigner, no partner, just Maeve Keller, sole owner, exactly the way my grandmother taught me. That house was not square footage to me. It was proof that the quiet girl who fixed everyone else's problems could build something of her own, on her own ground that nobody could take. My family came to the housewarming. They admired the floors I had refinished and ate the food I cooked in the kitchen I had rebuilt. And then, I would learn they quietly filed the whole thing away as a family asset. A nice big house that happened to have my name on it, the way a coat happens to be hanging on a hook. A spare room with the wrong name on the lease. I did not know they thought that. Not until Christmas Eve. Not until my mother's voice came through that thin kitchen wall, warm and certain, deciding my life. I had driven out to my parents' house that Christmas Eve the way I drove out every year, with a pie in the passenger seat and a check folded in my coat pocket. The pie was for the table. The check was for my father's latest round of medical bills. I had stopped thinking of it as a gift years ago. It was just a thing I did, like bringing the pie. The driveway was full when I got there. Tara's SUV, my aunt's car, the usual crowd, and parked across the street where I almost didn't notice it, a big white rental moving truck, the kind you book by the day. I remember looking at it and thinking it was strange, because nobody on that street was moving in the dead of December. Then I told myself I was tired and reading into things, and I balanced the pie and climbed the porch steps, where my grandmother once taught me to plant bulbs. And I had no idea that by the end of the night that porch would feel like enemy territory. Dinner was loud in the good way at first. 11 of us crammed around a table built for 8, elbows touching, gravy going around twice. My father sat at the head with a particular look on his face, the look he got when he was holding a card he couldn't wait to play. Halfway through the ham, he tapped his glass and announced he had a special announcement, but that it would have to wait until everyone was finished eating. My sister Tara caught her husband's eye across the table. Brett grinned down at his plate. The kids kept asking if the surprise was a puppy. I guessed in my head, the way you do. A new baby, a new job for Brett, whose contracting business had folded back in the fall and who had been out of work since. I wanted it to be good news. I always wanted it to be good news for them. And then Brett leaned toward me, easy as anything, and asked me a question that landed wrong in my stomach. He asked, just curious, whether a house like mine could ever be rented out or signed over to someone else, hypothetically, if a person wanted to. I told him it was paid off and in my name, so I could do whatever I wanted with it, and I changed the subject. He nodded slowly, like I had confirmed something. Tara smiled down at her plate. My mother got up to start the coffee with a little spring in her step. I told myself families ask nosy questions. I told myself the truck across the street belonged to a neighbor. And then I picked up a stack of dishes and carried them into the kitchen, because clearing the table was my job, and that was where the night broke in half, because the kitchen shared a thin wall with the dining room, and my mother's voice carried right through it. If you have ever overheard the people who love you decide something about your life that they never planned to ask you about, you know the specific cold that goes through you. Subscribe, because what I did with that cold is the whole reason I'm telling you this. I stood at the sink with a stack of dirty plates in my hands, and I did not move, because through the wall I could hear my mother talking to Tara, low and warm, in the voice she used when something had already been decided. She was saying the kids could each have their own room. She was saying Brett could put a workshop in the basement. She was saying they would move in right after the new year so the children could start fresh at the better school across town. For a few seconds, my brain simply refused to assemble the words because they did not make sense in any arrangement I could accept. They were talking about my house, my floors, my garden, my grandmother's scripture made of brick and oak. And then my mother said the thing I will hear for the rest of my life. She said it gently, reasonably, the way you state something obvious and kind. She said, and honestly, it's wasted on Maeve. It's just her, rattling around in that whole house by herself. She doesn't need all that room. Tara's the one with a family. It's wasted on Maeve. It's just her. She doesn't need all that room. Like my home was a mistake in the distribution. Like I had been accidentally handed too large a slice, and the decent thing, the obvious thing, was to scrape some of it onto my sister's plate. I set the plates down very, very carefully so they would not clatter, and I noticed that my hands were perfectly steady, which surprised me, because I had expected to feel rage. Instead, I felt a cold, clean stillness, the way the air goes quiet right before real weather. And standing there, I understood something. This was not a plan they were going to ask me about. It was a plan they had already finished. The asking had been skipped on purpose, because somewhere in their hearts they were certain I would say yes. I always said yes. The yes was so guaranteed that the question had become a formality not even worth the breath. I dried my hands. I walked back toward the dining room, and my father was already getting to his feet. He tapped his glass until the room went quiet, and he looked happier than I had seen him in years. He talked about how the family had been through a hard stretch, how Brett's work had dried up, how the kids needed stability and a yard and a real home. And then he said that he and my mother had decided to give Tara's family the house. My house. He said it like a benediction. And then everyone turned to look at me, because of course the house was mine, and everyone at that table knew it was mine, and there was a half second where the whole room held its breath to see what I would do. Tara was already crying happy tears. The kids were cheering about their new rooms. Brett had his arm around my sister and his eyes on me, and there was something in his face that was not gratitude. It was a dare. My father lifted his glass toward me and said the two words that became the knife I carried for the next 6 days. He said, "It's settled. It's settled." Like my signature on a recorded deed was a sentiment. Like my ownership was a feeling that could be voted on by a roomful of people who had never paid $1 toward it. And here is the part I still think about. I smiled. I lifted my own glass. I clapped, soft and even, just like everyone else. I said, "Well, what a way to ring in the new year." My mother beamed. My father sat back down, satisfied, certain he had read me correctly one more time. Tara mouthed thank you across the table, and I let her. Because in that moment I understood the trap completely, with the clarity I get when I see exactly how a deal is structured. If I argued, I would be the villain. The cold one. The selfish single woman who put square footage over her own niece and nephew at Christmas. They had built the moment so that any honest reaction would prove their story about me. A crowded room, a generous announcement, crying children. Any objection I raised would look like cruelty. They had stacked the deck so that the only graceful move was surrender. So I did not give them a reaction. I clapped and I smiled, and very quietly underneath it, I started to do the only thing I truly know how to do. I started to plan a clean, final, airtight transfer of property. They just had no idea who the property was going to. I drove home that night with my hands at 10 and 2 and my mind a mile ahead of the road. The strangest part was how little I felt like crying. I kept waiting for it, and it never came. What came instead was the calm, sorting clarity that I live in at work, the part of me that takes a messy situation and reduces it to a clean sequence of steps. I do closings for a living. When the world stops making sense, I do not fall apart. I make it clean. I make it final. I make it so that years later, nobody can argue. And somewhere on that dark highway, the closing officer and me quietly took over from the heartbroken daughter, and she had a question the daughter had been too stunned to ask. A simple, professional question. Whose name was actually on the deed? Mine. Only mine. I knew it the way I knew my own birthday, because I had sat at a closing table 6 years ago and signed every page myself, and because I spend my days making sure deeds say exactly what they say. My family had spent Christmas Eve giving away a house that they had no more right to give than they had to give away the moon. They believed the house belonged to the family, not as a metaphor, as a fact. In their version of the world, I was a kind of holding account, and the assets simply flowed to whoever cried the loudest, and right now that was Tara. And the worst part, the part that kept my hands cold and steady on the wheel, was that I had taught them to think that way. Every check, every quiet rescue, every time I took care of it because I always took care of it. I had trained my own family, over 10 years, to treat my life as a shared resource, until they genuinely forgot that a line between us had ever existed. I did not blame myself for being generous. I blamed myself for never once drawing a line, so that they forgot a line was even possible. I was not going to argue at a dinner table. Arguing was their game, and they had stacked it. But I had my own game, the one I am good at, the one with documents and deadlines and clean math and no room left to argue. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my own restored house, under the porch light I had wired myself, I had remembered an email I had not thought about in almost a year. An email from a man who had wanted to buy my house once, when I had no reason in the world to sell it. I went inside, and I did not turn on the lights, and I sat on my own refinished floor in the dark, and I started to build the closing. I woke up the morning after Christmas to a text from my sister and a photograph that turned my coffee to acid. The text said, "Thank you so much, sis. You have no idea what this means to us." The photo showed my niece and nephew standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, in their Christmas coats, pointing up at the second-floor windows and grinning. Brett had driven them over on Christmas morning to let them pick which bedrooms would be theirs. They were choosing curtains for rooms in a home I had not agreed to give up. A second text came in while I was still staring at the first. Tara asked if I could have the place empty by the 15th because the kids' new semester started on the 20th and they wanted time to settle in. Empty. She used the word empty, like I was a storage unit they had finished renting and were now reclaiming. I put the phone face down on the counter and I made my coffee and I drank it slowly while it cooled, and I want you to understand that I was not frozen. I was deciding. Part of me wanted to call her and scream the truth, that she was choosing curtains for a house she did not own, that our parents had promised her my walls as if they were theirs to promise. But I had learned something at that table. The second I got loud, I lost. They would circle the wagons around the crying sister, and the out-of-work husband, and the children who had already picked their rooms, and I would become the heartless aunt who took bedrooms away from kids at Christmas. So I texted back 2 words, "Talk soon," and then I opened my laptop and went looking for an email from a man named Marcus Reyes. But before I did anything irreversible, I gave them one chance. I owed that to myself, even if I did not owe it to them. I drove back out to my parents' house on the 27th and sat at the same kitchen table where the announcement had been made, and I told them the truth, plainly, with no heat in it. I said the house was mine. I said my name was the only name on the deed. I said I had bought it as a wreck and rebuilt it myself and paid for every nail, and that no one had ever asked me whether I wanted to give it away. I kept my voice level. I was not there to fight. I was there to hold a door open and see if they would walk through it. My father's face went tight. He said I was making it about money when it should be about family. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand, the way you soothe a child, and told me not to be selfish. She said Tara needed it more. She said the children needed it. She said I was young and single and could always just buy myself another house someday, as if I rebuilt a home from a ruin every couple of years, as if 4 years of my life on my knees on those floors were a thing you could simply repeat. And she said it all so kindly. That was what finally undid the last knot in me. She was not being cruel. She genuinely could not see why a home with my name on it was not simply available to whichever member of the family was struggling most. To her, my drawing a line was the selfish act, not their giving away of my house. In her world, my having more than I strictly needed was the problem, and my objecting to it being taken was a character flaw. I looked at the two of them, and I understood that the door was never going to open. They had not made a mistake I could correct with facts. They had an entire worldview, and in it, I existed to quietly absorb the family's problems, and a fact could no more change that than a fact can change the weather. So I stopped explaining. If you have ever sat across a table from people who love you and realized they simply cannot hear you, you know the specific loneliness of that kitchen. Hold on to that feeling. We are going to need it later. I told them I would think about it, and I drove home to make a phone call. Brett showed up at my house that same evening without calling. I opened my door and he was standing on my porch in his work coat, holding a tape measure, and the white rental truck was idling at the curb, the same truck I had seen across the street on Christmas Eve. He had already booked it for January 1st. He asked, friendly enough, if he could measure the second bedroom for the kids' bunk beds. Like the house was already his. I did not let him in. When I told him the house was not his to measure, the friendliness slid off his face like wet paint. He told me his business had collapsed, that creditors were calling his phone at dinner, that this house was the only thing standing between his kids and a worse apartment than the one they were in now. And I felt for him. That is the honest truth, and it made everything harder. But then he said the family had decided, and that I was outvoted, and that I needed to fall in line. Outvoted on my own home. The home I rebuilt with my own hands. I came very close, right then, to telling him exactly what I had spent the afternoon arranging. The words were in my mouth. I wanted to wipe the entitlement clean off his face. But I swallowed it because a loud win is a small win, and I wanted the kind that lasts. I told him to take his tape measure home. I closed the door in his face. And through it I heard him say I would regret this. I leaned my back against my own door, in my own house, and I almost laughed at how wrong he had it. The only thing I regretted was how long I had waited. That night I sat on my living room floor again, back against the couch, and I opened my laptop and searched my inbox for a name I had almost forgotten. Marcus Reyes. He was a local property investor who had knocked on doors in my neighborhood about a year earlier, looking to buy and rent out the restored houses on my block. Most of us had ignored him. He had sent me a polite, specific email offering to buy my house, cash, no contingencies, and I had written back a polite no thank you, because I loved my home and had no reason on earth to sell it. I found the thread halfway down a folder. His offer was still there in black and white, a real number, only a little under what the house might fetch with months of showings. At the bottom he had written that the offer stood if I ever changed my mind, and he had left his cell number. I sat and looked at it for a long time, Selling my house would hurt. I am not going to pretend otherwise. This was the place I had rebuilt from a ruin, the place that proved I could stand on my own ground. But I had learned, on Christmas Eve, exactly what my family believed my house was for. It was a thing they could give away. As long as I held it, they would treat it as the family pantry, something to be raided whenever anyone got hungry. There was only one way to make it permanently, completely mine in the only sense that mattered now. I had to make it nobody's. I had to make it gone. You cannot give away what no longer exists. I copied Marcus Ray's number into my phone. But I did not call yet. There was one thing I needed to be certain of first, and one box I needed to open. The next morning I confirmed, in writing, the thing I already knew in my bones, because I am the kind of person who confirms things in writing. I did not need anyone to tell me I could sell my own house. I closed property sales for a living. But I wanted this one bulletproof, because I knew that the moment it was done, my family would look for any crack to argue through. So I called a real estate attorney I had worked with for years, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Gabriela Ortiz, and I asked her to confirm what I needed. Sole owner, no mortgage, clean title. Could anyone stop me, slow me, or undo it? She actually laughed. Maeve, she said, you of all people know the answer. It's your property. You can sell it to a stranger on the sidewalk if you feel like it. Nobody else gets a vote, nobody else has to sign, and once it records, it's final. I asked how fast a cash sale could close with a clean title and a motivated buyer. She said, with the right title company moving fast, you could record by the 30th. I thanked her and hung up and sat very still. And then the second piece fell into place. The one I had been quietly carrying for 2 weeks and had told no one about. My company had offered me a transfer, a senior closing position opening their new branch office down in Savannah, Georgia. More money, a warmer city, a fresh start in a place where I knew exactly no one. I had been on the fence about it for weeks, leaning toward turning it down, and the only reason was my family. The checks, the rescues, the feeling that I was the load-bearing wall holding everyone up, that if I left, the whole structure would come down. I had been about to say no to my own future to keep propping up people who had just voted to take my house. Sitting on my floor that morning, with Gabriella's words in my ears and my sister's text about being empty by the 15th still glowing on my phone, the fence simply vanished. There was nothing holding me here that was worth being held back for. I could sell the house, take the job, and start a life in a city where no one had ever once decided what I did and did not need. All I had to do was move faster than my own family. I almost didn't do it. I want to be honest about that, because if I tell you I was certain the whole way through, you will not believe me, and you should not. That night I sat on my bedroom floor with a cardboard box I had carried through 4 moves and never unpacked. Inside were the bones of my 20s, a community college graduation tassel, a photo of my grandmother Vera squinting in the sun in her garden, a watch that had stopped working years ago, and, soft at the folds, the very first apartment lease she had co-signed for me at that diner, her signature next to mine in faded ink. I held those things and I let myself doubt, because this was still my family. My mother had braided my hair. My father had taught me to drive in an empty parking lot. Tara and I had shared a room as girls and whispered to each other after the lights went out. Selling my home and vanishing to another state felt enormous. It felt mean. It felt like the kind of thing you cannot take back. I asked myself if I was overreacting, if I was punishing children for what their parents had done, if a better daughter would just give a little and keep the peace. I sat with all of it honestly for a long time, and then I reached down to the very bottom of the box, underneath the lease, to the one folder I had kept and almost never opened since the day I closed on my house. When I lifted it out, my doubt did not disappear, but it finally had something solid to lean against. Because my grandmother had given me that folder the week I bought the house, with a copy of my deed already tucked inside, and I had been too overwhelmed that day to really read what she had written on the front of it. I read it now under the lamp in her blocky, careful hand. She had written 3 words. Yours, no one else's. That was all. Yours, no one else's. My grandmother, who had watched her own mother get talked out of a house by relatives 2 generations back, who knew exactly how families do this, had left me a message for a night she would not live to see. She died 3 years before that Christmas. But she had known. She had known that someday someone would try to tell me my home was not really mine, and she had left me the answer in advance, sitting in a folder at the bottom of a box. I did not cry the loud way. I cried the quiet way, the way you cry when something finally makes sense, because her 3 words settled the argument my parents thought they had already won. The house was mine to keep, mine to sell, mine to do whatever I wanted with. It had never once been on the family ballot. I put the deed back in the folder, and I set the folder on my nightstand where I could see it, and I picked up my phone and I called Marcus Ray's. He picked up on the second ring, even though it was the holidays and most people were still in their fog. I told him who I was, gave him the address, and said that if his offer still stood, I was ready to talk. There was a pause, and then I heard him smile through the phone. He said the offer stood, and that the market had actually nudged up since, so he could do a little better than the original number. He asked what had changed my mind. I told him the truth, more or less. I said my circumstances had changed and I needed to move fast and clean. He liked the word clean. People in his business always do. He said if the title was clear and I was firm, he could open escrow the next day and record by the 30th. I said the 30th worked. I said it the way I would confirm a dentist appointment. And inside my chest, something broke and steadied at the very same time. If this is landing for you, if you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, do me one favor and hold that feeling for another minute, because what happened on New Year's Eve is the entire reason I am telling you any of this. Marcus and I agreed on the number that night. He sent his title company's information before we even hung up, and I forwarded everything to Gabriella within the hour and asked her to make every signature, every disclosure, every stamp airtight, because I did not want one single crack for anyone to argue through later. And just like that, quietly, legally, the machine began to move. 3 days out from a New Year's Eve dinner where my father planned to hand my sister a key to a house that would no longer be ours to give. The next 2 days were the strangest of my life, because on the outside, nothing happened and underneath everything did. I went to work. I answered emails. I let my phone fill with messages from my family, and I poured gasoline on none of them. Meanwhile, escrow opened. The title search came back and confirmed exactly what I already knew. Clean title, no liens, no co-owners, no surprises, one name. Because I do this for a living, I read every page of the purchase agreement twice, and that habit, the very carefulness my family had spent years gently mocking, made the whole thing seamless. I signed the disclosures. We scheduled the recording for the morning of the 30th. The hardest part was not the paperwork. The hardest part was the silence. My family thought I was sulking, but coming around. Tara texted to ask if I had picked a moving date. My mother left a voicemail saying she just knew I would do the right thing in the end, that I had always been the sensible one. Every message assumed my surrender was simply a matter of time, and I let them assume it. I did not lie to a single one of them. I just stopped explaining myself to people who had never once asked me a real question. There's a kind of power in that quiet that I had never once let myself use. My whole life I had over-explained, overfunctioned, over-apologized, smoothed every edge before anyone could feel it. Now I just went still. I answered with a thumbs up or a single short line, and I let the machine run. If you are the person in your family who always smooths things over, you know how unnatural it feels to stop. It felt like holding my breath underwater. But I was almost to the surface. 2 more days. The pressure got worse as the 30th approached, the way it always does right before people lose. Tara called 4 times on the 29th. When I finally picked up, she had the kids loud in the background and her voice was sweet and tight at the same time. She wanted to know when she could get a key. She said the kids were so excited. Did I really want to break their hearts? There it was, the children stacked up like sandbags in front of her. I told her we would talk after the new year, and I kept my voice as flat and warm as a closed door. My mother texted me a photo of curtains she had bought for the kids' new rooms. She had spent money she did not have on window treatments for windows she did not own. I looked at that photo for a long time, and what I felt was not anger anymore. It was a kind of grief because these were people I loved, and they had walked so far out onto a branch that I could no longer warn them off it without becoming the villain for letting it break. They had built this, board by board. Every assumption was a nail they had driven themselves. All I was going to do was stop holding the ladder. My father did not call. My father did not text. He was so certain it was settled that he saw no reason to check on me, and that, more than anything, told me I was doing the right thing. A man who truly believed the house was mine would have at least asked if I was okay. He never wondered. He had already moved on to planning his toast. And I knew there would be a toast. I knew my father. And I was beginning to understand exactly how I was going to answer it. The only call I actually wanted came on the night of the 29th from my Aunt Maureen, my mother's younger sister, the one who has always said the quiet part out loud at every family funeral. She called and asked, straight off, if I was okay. And the question caught me so off guard that I almost couldn't answer it, because she was the first person in my family in a week to ask how I felt instead of what I was going to give. She told me my father had been calling everyone, the cousins, the neighbors, the old crowd from church. He had been telling all of them about the generous gift, the house for Tara's family, the proud grandfather making everything right. She said he had practically sold tickets to New Year's Eve so people could watch him hand over the key. And she said something about it did not sit right with her, because she remembered me buying that wreck. She remembered how hard I had worked on it. I thanked her for asking. And I made a decision in that moment. I did not tell her my plan because I trusted her heart but not her ability to keep a secret in a family that ran on gossip. But I asked her one thing. I asked if she was going to be at the dinner. She said she would. Good, I thought, because what I was about to do needed a witness. and not the kind my father had invited to applaud him. I needed at least one person in that room who knew the truth of where that house came from, so that when the story got retold 100 times afterward, twisted to make me the villain, there would be one voice that could say, plainly, I was there, and that is not how it happened. Maureen was going to be that voice. She just didn't know it yet. The closing was at 9 in the morning on the 30th, in a small office that smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. I have sat on the other side of that table 1,000 times. It is a strange thing to be the one signing. It took 40 minutes. That is the part nobody tells you. The thing that takes 10 years and 4 years of sweat to build can change hands in 40 minutes with a pen and a notary and a stack of paper. I signed where the little flags pointed. Marcus signed across from me, calm and satisfied, a man who had wanted that house for a year and finally had it. The funds would hit my account by the end of the day. And then it was done. The house was no longer mine. I drove back to it one last time and let myself in with a key that was not really mine anymore, and I stood in the empty living room I had rebuilt with my own 2 hands. The winter light came through the windows the way it always had, indifferent to whose name was on the deed. I let myself feel the loss because it was real, and pretending it wasn't would have been its own kind of lie. But I had given my home up by choice, on my terms, to a stranger, instead of having it taken from me by people who never asked. There is a world of difference between losing something and letting it go. My grandmother's folder was already packed in my car. I walked through the rooms one slow time, said goodbye to the garden through the back window, and locked the door behind me for the last time. By the time Brett's rental truck pulled up on the morning of January 1st, there would be a stranger's name on the title, and the locks already changed. But before that, there was a dinner, and there was a toast to answer. I could have just not shown up. I could have let them drive to a locked door on New Year's Day and learn the truth without me there. It would have been cleaner. But I am not built for clean disappearances, not entirely. My family had made their decision in a crowded room on purpose, so the crowd would pressure me into yes. I decided the truth deserved the very same audience. Not purely for revenge, though I will not insult you by pretending there was none in it. Mostly because I was tired of being the quiet one who absorbed everything in private while they performed their version of events in public. I wanted to stand in the same light my father had chosen for his toast and say one true thing out loud, where everyone could hear it. And then I wanted to leave and keep leaving, all the way to Savannah. So I dressed the way you dress for armor, and I drove out to my parents' house one final time, with a slim folder in my bag instead of a key. The New Year's Eve dinner was even more crowded than Christmas. Half the family and a few neighbors, just as Maureen had warned. Streamers on the mantel, the good champagne my parents saved for weddings. Tara and Brett sat near the head of the table like the guests of honor, and the kids were wired on soda and the promise of new bedrooms. I came in quietly, kissed my mother's cheek, set a covered dish on the counter like always. I said almost nothing through dinner. I watched my father glow. I watched Brett lean back in his chair like a man who already had the keys in his pocket. I caught Maureen's eye once, and she gave me a small, worried nod. When the plates were cleared, my father stood and tapped his glass, and the room went obediently quiet, because this was the moment he had been advertising for a week. He talked about family, about hard times, about sticking together. And then he held up a single brass key on a length of ribbon, a prop he had clearly bought for the occasion, and he announced that as of the new year, Tara's family would finally have a real home, his gift to his grandchildren. He looked right at me when he said gift, daring me to flinch. And then he said it again, the same line from Christmas, the one he was so sure was a closed door. It's settled. The room burst into applause. Champagne started pouring. Tara was crying her easy, pretty tears. Brett reached out and took the brass key from my father's hand like it meant something. Everyone turned to me, waiting for the gracious aunt to smile and bless it the way I had at Christmas. My mother watched me with hopeful, shining eyes. I set down my napkin. And for the first time in my life, I did not give them what they expected. I stood up, and I did not raise my voice. That was the entire strategy. The only one that ever works against people who are expecting you to break. I waited until the applause died down on its own, until the curiosity in the room got heavier than the celebration, and then I spoke in the calm, even voice I used to deliver hard news at a closing table. I said, before anyone gets too comfortable, there's something all of you need to know. I opened the folder and I laid 2 pieces of paper on the table, right next to the champagne. The first was a copy of my deed, with my name, and only my name, highlighted. The second was the recorded closing statement, dated the 30th, signed and stamped. I slid them down the table toward my father so he could see them clearly. You can't give away something that was never yours, I said. My voice did not shake. This house was mine, my name nobody else's, and it isn't mine anymore either. I sold it 3 days ago. It recorded on the 30th. A stranger owns it now and his locks are already on the doors. The room did not understand at first. There was a beat of confused silence, people glancing at each other to check if they had heard it right. My father picked up the closing statement. I watched his eyes travel down the page to the date and the signatures and the one word that ended it, sold. His face changed slowly, like ice going gray before it cracks. Tara stopped crying. Brett set the brass key down on the table with a small click that was somehow the loudest sound in the room. My mother put her hand over her mouth, and I just stood there, calm as a winter morning, and let the paper do what 10 years of my explaining never could. I had spent my whole life trying to make these people hear me with my voice. It turned out all I had ever needed was a recorded date and the nerve to stop apologizing. The quiet held for one long second, then it broke. Brett went first, the way I knew he would. He shot to his feet so fast his chair tipped over behind him. He slammed his hand flat on the table, and the champagne glasses jumped, and he shouted that I had ruined his family, that I had stabbed my own niece and nephew in the back, that the truck was booked. The kids had picked their rooms. Who did I think I was? His face went purple. Tara was right behind him, crying for real now, the ugly kind, demanding to know how I could be so cruel, so selfish, so cold. The room I had stayed so calm in turned into noise and pointing fingers, and at the center of it I just stood with my hands folded, which made them angrier because there was nothing to push against. My father found his voice and roared that I had no right, that this was a family matter. How dare I? And that was when I gave the line back to them. The one my mother had said through the kitchen wall on Christmas Eve, the one that started all of it. I waited for a gap in the shouting, and I said it quietly, so they had to go still to hear it. I said, you all kept telling everyone it was wasted on me, that it was just me, that I didn't need all that room. I let it land. Well, now none of us have it. The whole room went dead silent. Tara's mouth opened and nothing came out. Brett's purple face just hung there. My father sat down hard like his legs had quit. I had not yelled. I had not insulted anyone. I had simply handed them back their own words with the math attached, and the math was final. Across the table, Aunt Maureen had both hands pressed to her chest, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was nodding, the way you nod when somebody finally says the true thing out loud. It was my mother who got to me, the way only a mother can. In the middle of all that noise, she did not yell. She just looked at me, her hand still over her mouth, her eyes wet and bewildered, and she said in a small voice, "But honey, you always seemed so fine." And there it was, the whole thing in one sentence with no villain in it at all, just a lifetime of quiet assumption. She had decided long ago and completely that I was fine. And once she decided it, she stopped checking, and it became the foundation she built everything else on. My being fine was the bedrock under all of it. The checks, the rescues, the giving away of my home. Maeve is fine. Maeve doesn't need help. Maeve doesn't need all that room. Maeve will understand. I felt my throat go tight, but I did not let it pull me off course because softening here would have undone everything. I looked at my mother and I said gently, "That was the problem, Mom. You decided I was fine, so my whole life became something you could spend." I told her I loved her and I meant it, and that was what made it land. I told her I was done being the family's emergency fund. I told her the bank was closed, not in anger. In the flat, certain voice of a woman reading out a final balance. She started to cry, and part of me wanted to cross the room and hold her, the way I had held this whole family together for a decade. I didn't. Some lines only count if you let the other person feel their weight. The room had been comfortable at my expense for 34 years. It could sit in the discomfort for one night. I picked up my deed and my closing statement and slid them back into the folder, because they were mine to keep, like everything else I had earned. Then I said the last thing I had come to say, and I said it to the whole table, to the cousins and the neighbors and everyone my father had invited to watch him be generous with my house. I told them the money from the sale was mine. I told them my life was mine. I told them I had taken a job in another city and that I would be gone within the week. I said I would always be their family, but that I would never again be their account. And then I reached into my coat pocket and took out the spare key to my parents' house, the one I had carried for years so I could let myself in at any hour to fix whatever was broken, to be the reliable one. I set it on the table next to Brett's useless brass prop. I said, "I think you can all manage from here." I thanked my mother for dinner because she had still cooked it, and manners outlive everything, and I walked out. Nobody followed me at first. The room was too stunned to move. And as I reached the door, I heard Aunt Maureen's voice behind me, clear and steady, saying to the whole table, "She's right, you know. I watched that girl buy that house. It was a wreck, and she fixed it with her own hands, and not one of you lifted a finger. Not one." That was the witness I had come for. I stepped out into the cold, and the night air hit my face, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my chest felt wide open instead of clenched. I left for Savannah on the morning of January 1st, my car packed to the roof, the sunrise in my mirrors. Somewhere in the second hour of the drive, my phone began to light up, and it did not stop. By the time I pulled over for gas at noon, the screen said 64 missed calls. I sat in the gas station lot and scrolled through them once, just once, before I turned the ringer off for good. Brett had called 9 times, his voicemail swinging from threats to bargaining and back to threats. Tara had called and texted in long, weepy paragraphs about how I had broken her children's hearts, never once mentioning that she had planned to take my home without asking. My father called twice and left no message because my father does not apologize. He waits for the world to come back around to him. This time it was not going to. My mother called the most. Hers were the only voicemails I listened to twice. In the last one she was not angry. She just said, "Please call me back, honey, please." And I sat there in that cold parking lot and let myself feel exactly how much I still loved her and how I still was not going to call. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. The only message I answered was from Aunt Maureen. It said, "You did the right thing and I'm proud of you, and don't you dare let them tell you otherwise." I wrote back, "Thank you." Then I turned off the ringer and I drove south. The fallout in the plain accounting of it looked like this. Tara's family did not get a house because there was no house to get. Brett returned the rental truck and paid the cancellation fee out of money he did not have. My parents had to explain to every cousin and neighbor and churchgoer they had bragged to that the generous gift had simply evaporated because it had never been theirs to give. And for the first time in years, when something in that family broke, the phone that rang was not mine. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that too. I felt quiet. I felt like a woman who had finally stopped bailing water out of a boat she did not even own and had stepped onto dry land and was surprised to find that it held. I built a life in Savannah. The new branch did well, and I did well in it, and I bought a small house there too eventually, a little place with a crooked porch and good light, and I rebuilt parts of it myself, on my knees on the floors, the way I know how. My name is the only name on that deed. My grandmother's folder sits in a drawer in that house, and sometimes I take it out and read the 3 words on the front, and I think about how she knew, 3 years before it happened, exactly which night I would need them. My family and I are not in close contact now. My mother has tried over time, and her efforts always circle back, gently, to how hard things have been, to whether I might help just this once the way I used to. The answer is always no, and it gets easier to say every time. I love them the complicated way you love the people who made you from a distance, with a closed wallet and finally a peaceful heart. Tara and I do not speak. I wish her well the way you wish a stranger well. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, I will give it to you the way my grandmother gave things to me. Plain, and once. Loving your family does not mean letting them spend your life like it's loose change in the family jar. You are allowed to own something that nobody else gets a vote on. And the first thing you are allowed to own, completely, in your own name and no one else's, is yourself. That is where I will leave it tonight. The dish towel in the kitchen, the toast with my house in it, the brass key on the ribbon, and the 64 calls I never returned. If you have ever been the reliable one, the one everybody counts on and nobody asks about, let this be your sign to check whose name is really on your life. Tell me in the comments about the moment you finally drew your line. I read every one. And if this reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.